Before we can validate our input, we need to be able to submit the form. At the moment, we don't have any means for that. So within our wrapper.view file, within the template, for our form tag, we are going to add submit event with prevent event modifier. And when we submit the form, what we want to do, we want to call the submit method. Now this prevent modifier will make sure that the page does not reload and data is going to be processed internally by this component. Okay, within the methods, let's add this submit method. So submit. And what I would like to do from within the submit method is first validate the data. So this validate. And if all input is valid, then I would like to make a call. So this make call. Otherwise, I would like to catch the error and display the error messages accordingly. So catch this call failed. Now, we've used 3 different methods here. As you can see, validate, which we don't have yet. We don't have this make call and we don't have this call failed. So let's quickly add this. We're going to start with validate. Just method stubs for the time being, make call and call failed, which will take the error as an argument. In order for us to be able to use then and catch, we need to return a promise from within this validate method. So let's start with this. Return new promise, and promise takes 2 arguments. First one is resolve, which will be called when validation has succeeded, there are no errors. Otherwise, we are going to call reject. Let's quickly use the arrow function here. And from within this new promise instance, we are first going to check whether we actually require validation in the first place. Because if our validation bag is empty, then obviously we don't have to validate anything. So let's do this way. If, and we're going to check if it isn't. So this requires validation. And that's going to be a method. We haven't got it yet. Then we simply resolve this promise and we don't do anything else, so return after this. Let's quickly add this requires validation method after the validate one. And requires validation will just check if our validation bag object has any properties. So return object, let's get all its keys, so keys, and we pass the object we want to obtain these keys from. So this validation bag. And then we check the length, how many of them there are. If there are more than 0, that means that we will require validation, otherwise we won't. After this, what we are going to do is instantiate a new property, this error, which will be the container for all our errors, our validation errors. And let's do this new error. We don't have this class yet. Let's first add this property to our data properties section. So error, and it's going to be by default new error. Now let's scroll up, and before we create this class, let's pass this error and submit methods to the slot, so they are also available within the view. We are going to start with error equals error, so we can access all these error messages later on from within the slot, and submit, which will represent submit method. So we can also trigger this submit method with any buttons and so on. Okay, now within the form directory of our components, let's create a new directory called Validator. Inside of this Validator, we are going to create a new JavaScript file called error. And now what we're going to do is type export default class error. And before we do anything else, let's import this class to our wrapper component. So import error from current directory, we go for validator and error. Now that we've imported it, our IDE automatically recognizes it as a valid entity. Okay, let's go back to our error class, and we are going to start with the constructor. Constructor will instantiate the new property called errors. And by default, it's going to be an empty object. The next method we will need is the method that allows us to set all the errors. So set, it will take errors as argument, and it will simply override this errors property by associating this argument with it. Then we will have a method that returns all errors. So all and let's use return this errors. Method that will clear all errors. So clear, and this will be this errors equals new object. And as you can see, the same thing happens within the constructor when we're actually instantiating this. So why don't we just swap it with the call to the clear method, which will do exactly the same thing. Now, after the clear, we also need to have a method that checks whether form has any errors for a given field and possibly even a rule for that field. So has method, it will take field and rule, which will be optional. So by default, we'll set it to null. Now we're going to start with a constant called hasProperty, and we're going to check this by going through this errors has own property, and the property name will be stored within this field argument. So now we check if rule is null, which means the second argument hasn't been provided, then return has property. If we have the field within our errors collection, then that means that there obviously is a validation error for this given field. Otherwise, we need to not only check whether it has a property, but also the rule. So return has property, but also this errors, and we check field. So we have the property of these errors equals rule. In other words, is the value associated with this property, represented by the field, equal to the given rule? So has it got the property, and is the value associated with this property equal to the given rule? Okay, so that's our error class. Let's just save and close it. Now going back to our wrapper.view, after we've instantiated this error property, let's now call new validator, to which we will pass instance of itself, of this wrapper, and then we are going to pass resolve and reject callbacks to it. Now we don't have this validator, so let's quickly create it under the validator directory. So we're gonna go for another JavaScript file, validator, and now let's quickly import it as well right after this arrow. So it's going to be import validator from current directory, validator and validator, semicolon at the end. Okay, if we scroll down, now that's without any highlight, so it's available. Let's quickly export default class validator, and we are going to start with the constructor. Constructor takes the instance of the wrapper, so let's call it wrapper, and then it takes resolve, callback, as well as the reject one. From within the constructor, we're going to start by instantiating a few properties. This fields, which will be represented by wrapper fields. Then we're going to have this validation bug, again represented by wrappers validation bug. And then we are going to create internal errors property. By default, it's going to be an empty object. The next thing we want to do is to run through all of the validation bug properties and make sure that whichever one is being currently looped through has a value which is actually matching the validation rule for a given input within this fields collection. So let's start with a promise again. This time we are going to use all method, which means that all promises which we are going to pass through as an argument have to be resolved before we go to the then method. And the same goes for the catch. If any of these callbacks from within the all method, any of these promises has been rejected, then at the end of all of these, once they've been resolved or rejected, we will call this catch method. Okay, so for all, we are going to pass the collection of the promises as well. So let's use this promises, and let's create this method. So promises, and this method will simply start, we will simply start with a variable called promises, which will be an empty array to start with. And then we're going to go for the for loop, let field in this validation bug. And we're going to go for promises push. We add into this array this validate method, which we'll create in just a moment, and we pass in the field that we want to validate, and that will return the promise, obviously adding it to this promises array, and at the end we return this array altogether. Now let's just add method stub for this validate method. So validate, and it takes field, and let's just quickly return new promise, which takes resolve and reject. And for the time being, we are going to leave it like this. Let's go back to our constructor now. If all input has been valid, then all we need to do is to resolve this promise. Otherwise, we are going to catch the error. And here we are going to use the wrapper and its internal error property. If we go back to the wrapper, you can see we've instantiated this error class here. And on this class, we are going to use set method by passing the collected errors associated with this internal errors property, which we've instantiated here. And after this, we are going to reject the promise by passing message with the actual error sent through as an argument to this catch method. Now this reject will stop the execution of the form. So anything after this promise, which is this method here, the then method will not be called. We will, however, catch this error because we are rejecting. So when we are rejecting, the catch method is being called. When we are resolving, then this then method is being called. In other words, our errors, if we have any errors, any validation errors, will then be dealt with by this call failed callback method. If you would like to learn more about the promise object, which we've used during this video, navigate to developer.mozilla.org, search for the promise, and on the left-hand side you will find a list of all available methods you can use with the instance of this object.